I'm Jay Lipman, this is The Day Before Tomorrow, and today, green jobs. You see, we are watching in real time the birth of Generation Climate. These are the tens of thousands of individuals around the country that are recognizing that their unique life experience and work experience can be applied to solving climate change. And to talk about that, we have Kristy Drutman, who is the founder of Brown Girl Green and the co-founder of the Green Jobs Board, who is focused on increasing diversity in climate change, but also helping people get jobs in becoming part of the climate solution. Kristy, thank you for being here. Tell us a little bit about your story getting to where you are.
Yeah, so my journey started off, doing a lot of youth climate activism. I became really passionate about talking about the climate crisis and working with young people around the world to bring light to these issues. But over time, I learned that there was such a lack of diversity and inclusion in the climate space overall, both from, a racial standpoint, a gender standpoint, and, a young people standpoint, to actually feel like my voice mattered and could be heard in this space. Meanwhile, I was talking to climate scientists and policymakers who are all like, we're so frustrated, we don't know how to get people, to act on climate. But over here, I'm seeing this lack of this voice, this lack of storytelling and creativity in the climate movement. And so, I wanted to bridge that gap between having a voice that I felt wasn't being seen out in the world, while also being able to raise awareness about the climate crisis and now raising awareness about the need for a green economy. And so I always realized that digital media was a way to do that. And so I started using, these social media platforms to be able to tell those stories, to be able to create digestible, entertaining content that both inspired people who look like me that they could be a part of the climate movement, and also to inspire them that they could get a job in the climate movement as well.
Now, one of the things that you've talked about in the past that I've heard you talk about is this idea of imposter syndrome. And it made me think about this idea of climate imposter syndrome, because so many people want to be a part of this conversation, but don't necessarily feel like a climate expert. So help us understand what climate imposter syndrome is and how people can get over it.
There's a lot of people out in the world that are doing amazing things around climate, and I guess I would lump myself into that as well. But, a lot of people have the tendency to put people like myself on a pedestal, where they're viewing us as the answer to solving the climate crisis. They put us as the environmentalists, right? But that creates this culture of imposter syndrome where then people feel like, oh, I need a PhD. I need to be a climate scientist with X amount of years of research or experience. And we simply can't afford to rely on that anymore, especially when climate scientists themselves are being like, the public's not listening to me.
Yep.
And that's why I think the climate imposter syndrome is just a symptom of a bigger system that tries to convince people that as individuals, we don't have power to take action to raise our voice, and that it's up to the experts to solve it. But we can't afford to rely on the experts to solve it anymore.
I love that. And it makes me think, what does the average person actually look like in climate? Because not everyone is Greta or yourself or Sophia Kiani. Like, not everyone is on the front lines as an activist.
Yeah.
What does the average person look like who's actually in the climate fight?
I am so glad you asked that question. I would say that, the average person to me is someone who is on the front lines addressing the climate crisis. That is someone who's addressing mutual aid in their community, a nurse, a doctor. It could be even an accountant, someone who does things that, has a certain set of skills that maybe you don't view as a climate person, but is clearly going to be critical and continue to be critical for this fight. And so, for the work that I do at Green Jobs Board, we're all about pathways. So our whole thing is trying to help people who maybe don't view themselves as climate people and helping give them the tools and the resources to make that story accessible, to bring them on a journey from point A to point B, to maybe not see themselves as climate people today, but to see themselves as climate people tomorrow with, telling them, these transferable skills could be used towards climate action, and to see themselves in that picture, especially when it comes to, helping their communities, helping their families. How can we bring more of those people in who are not, who you think is a traditional climate person? We actually need those people more than the people who are currently in the echo chamber.
Now, one of the biggest issues with climate investing, climate tech, is that way too many people in the space look like me, right? Sound like me. How do we solve the lack of diversity in climate right now? And how are you working on that?
Yeah, I would say, there's not a lot of people who look like me on the opposite ends. I'm in a lot of rooms and I'm usually the only one. And I think when we're talking about the climate crisis, there needs to be more diversity and inclusion if we're going to actually be able to implement climate technologies in a way that centers justice, equity, and inclusion. And so I think in terms of addressing that issue, a really important part is investing, in climate tech founders of color. That's a direct way that people can be supporting this work to make sure it's diversified. I would say also thinking about creating resource networks, especially for women, minorities, LGBTQIA, et cetera, folks who are typically on the outliers of these conversations. How are we creating incubators and pathways? And so for us at the Green Jobs Board, we're always thinking about that. We're thinking about how do we increase more people to be in this conversation. And that felt really transferable from the work I was doing at Brown Girl Green. I was already building, this amazing online community using social media and doing diverse storytelling that made, other Black, Indigenous people of color feel more seen in this work. And I felt like that community came over to the Green Jobs Board and were like, wow, I'm feeling really seen in this type of content too, because it's like, I'm noticing that you're talking about pay disparity. We make sure there's salary transparency on our postings. We even have a BIPOC-owned label to emphasize BIPOC-owned organizations. And I've yet to see that much in the climate tech space at all. So we're constantly thinking about visibility, accessibility, inclusivity on the Green Jobs Board. And that's because we're a majority staff of people of color. We understand the gaps. Most of us don't come from intergenerational wealth. Our current company is not funded by intergenerational wealth or anything of the sort. It's truly a grassroots movement and community that is behind a climate tech company. And that's why I'm really proud of the Green Jobs Board, because we're changing the conversation and flipping the script on who gets to be in these rooms, who gets to be in these positions of power, and who gets to be in these climate jobs.
That's actually one of my favorite things about the content you create for the Green Jobs Board is you demystify so many of these questions about what the jobs look like, what they require, and how much they pay, which just makes it much more human. And it's done such a good job, I think, of just democratizing the idea that this can be for everyone. Let's get a bit more practical, right? You do spend a lot of your time working with people to help them get into climate, pivot into climate, understand the space. What would you say to someone that was 10 years out of school, right, that has some professional experience, that's looking to make that shift into climate tech today?
Yeah, I would say that there's so many transferable skills that haven't been identified as transferable into the climate space. So I think it's really valuable for those people to look at their transferable skills that they have on their CV and figure out where that's necessary. And I hear so many people who have backgrounds, like I was saying, I always go back to the climate accountant. So many climate tech companies, organizations need people that are accountants, for example. You never think of that person as a climate person, but having data analysis skills, being able to crunch numbers, being able to do things like programming and measurement. The climate movement overall just needs more data and more analysis to do better storytelling. And so I would say most of those people that I meet have that skill set. So it's how do we teach them and create that translation that they can use that and bring that into the climate space as well?
So for people that are interested, right, they're curious, but they're still trying to understand if climate tech is the future, is going to be around. What are some of the tailwinds, right? What is creating the opportunity right now that proves that climate tech is where people should be investing their career capital for the next 10 years or for the rest of our generation?
Right. Well, to start, the International Labor Organization, global worldwide body estimates that there's going to be over 20 million, climate jobs created in the next 10 years. And so, we're already seeing global bodies talking about it. We just recently saw, I don't remember the country, but they basically stated that, not investing in ESG is going to be a huge investment risk across the board for financial markets worldwide. And so I would say that just on the basis that we can't afford people to not be in climate, should already show that there's a high demand in it, because I think a lot of companies are identifying the financial, political, economic risk of, not being involved in the climate tech space. And that's why we're seeing such a shift of funding and resources, and companies that were not originally in climate now investing in all this programming and infrastructure to do something about it. So, the money is already telling the story. And so I think we have to tell people, this is a huge opportunity. Also, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, I had the honor of getting to be invited to the White House to learn about that a couple months ago. That was the creation of millions of jobs that they're now trying to figure out, how do we get all these people into those jobs? That there's so many jobs, they don't even know how to get all these people into those jobs. Whether you have a degree or not. And so I would say that it's now a question of, how do we skill people up? How do we train people and create the stories and the narratives that no matter where you're coming from and your starting point, you belong in this space. So I don't think it's a crisis of job creation. It's a question of deployment, of storytelling, and bringing more people into that conversation at the end of the day.
So, we get asked a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act. But the people that are asking us are typically more educated about climate.
100%.
For those people that are again exploring this, they're curious, how would you explain the kinds of opportunities that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to create in 3, 5, or 10 years?
Yeah, a big part of it is being able to totally revamp all of this renewable energy infrastructure and to really accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. And I would say that a lot of those jobs are not going to require a college degree. It's going to be trade skills. They're going to be good paying jobs that are going to be located in, a lot of these communities that have been historically disenfranchised and impacted by the fossil fuel industry and dependent on the fossil fuel industry. And so we're seeing that there's going to be a lot of new openings of a lot of industries that are going to be a part of this quote unquote clean energy transition. And that's a huge opportunity for people to hop on board, which is a part of it. But I would say another piece of it is this current administration is setting up the groundwork for more discussions around environmental policy, climate science, climate communications. And so there's going to be so many more roles that I think just from an expertise level are going to be needed to also figure out, how do we, manage all of those jobs and those roles as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of distribution of leadership and types of roles people can get involved in for sure over the next decade.
Now, something that you've talked a lot about is this idea of a just transition, but it's something that we get asked a lot about. Could you just help us to digest and understand that in a really simple way?
Yeah, so the just transition is really a framework that is thinking about, how do we actually move people who are currently in disenfranchised communities that are dependent on the fossil fuel industry that's, extractive and has a historic background of, extracting from these communities, and how do we move them towards, renewable energy. But at the same time, we have to make sure in that transition that these people aren't going to just lose their jobs and suddenly lose all their economic security. So it's about, prioritizing workers, labor unions, et cetera, in the process of that energy transition, and to make sure people don't get left behind. So it's all about, yes, we can transition towards more renewable energy technologies, but if we do that and leave workers out, continue to put them in positions of poverty and homelessness, we're not really creating something that is benefiting anyone. There's going to be a stopgap. So how are we making sure that there's educational programs, training programs, and even, programs to talk about why this transition is necessary. And that means putting workers' needs and well-being first at the core of that conversation.
So many people have asked us about the Green Jobs Board, and obviously on LinkedIn, everyone's talking about it as everyone starts to look for jobs in climate. Tell us what it is.
Yeah, so the Green Jobs Board essentially is a digital platform that is focused on bridging the gap between job seekers and employers who are trying to build a more just green economy. And so the Green Jobs Board to us is essentially a platform that is focused on building pathways for any person, no matter where your starting point is, to feel like they can get into climate jobs. We really prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that climate jobs are inclusive, transparent, and overall just fun and attractive to be a part of.
Kristy, you are famous for saying that every job can be a climate job. So we're actually going to go to a job fair right now, and we're going to explore how certain different jobs can be applied to solving the climate crisis. You ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. Kristy, thank you for joining us at the newest game show on Day Before Tomorrow, Job Fair, where we send you jobs and you tell us how they apply to climate change. Now, we're here in front of the electricians. So bloody important for climate change, but why?
Electricians are so critical to climate change. You know, you hear about those energy efficient buildings. How do you think those get made?
Exactly. Second, storytelling. How does a writer help us solve climate change?
If you can't tell a good story, how are you going to expect someone to actually take action on the cause that you care about? Strong writing is so critical for climate storytelling to get people to be on the same team as you, to want to take action.
The people over here, the chefs, right? They're cooking food, they're choosing the ingredients, they're choosing where they get it. How do they help us solve climate change?
You know, chefs easily could be helping implement more plant-based diets, be able to think about tasty recipes. People always say vegan food is hella bland. Chefs can be a part of changing that conversation ASAP.
I love that. Not historically, the leaders in climate is the finance person, but someone that we know is super important to driving capital towards climate solutions. So how do people in finance transition over to climate?
I mean, they're managing these big budgets of people that have a lot of like the wealth and the power to do something about the climate crisis. So they're able to do things like wealth management and to convince the people that they do manage the money for to push their money away from extractive industries into the industries that we need to, which is renewable energy technology, so on and so forth.
100%. Now, finally, I know this is your favorite. When you talk about every job being a climate job, you always talk about accountants, right? There's many of them. They can be part of the solution, but how?
You know, a lot of organizations need to crunch numbers, need to make sure that they're staying afloat and in their books correctly. And, you know, any climate organization needs that. So an accountant is really critical to make sure people are staying on top of it. So that way they don't also go underwater.
And with Kristy, what we've helped to determine here is that whether it is the individuals that actually help these companies to run as they should, the accountants, the lawyers, the salespeople, or whether it's the people in the field implementing these green technologies, electrifying buildings, helping us to accelerate to a clean energy transition, everyone can be part of the clean energy transition. Everyone can be part of the green economy. Thank you, Kristy.
Join us.